For decades, Presta valves have been the standard for performance cycling. Road bikes, mountain bikes, gravel bikes, tubeless setups, basically anything considered serious in cycling usually came with Presta valves. And honestly, they've worked fine. But fine doesn't necessarily mean optimized. Because if you really think about it, Presta valves are kind of weird by modern standards. The design is over 100 years old, relies on delicate external threads, uses a tiny manual loosened valve pin, and still requires surprisingly specific pumping process just to add air to a tire. And that's exactly why Schwalbe created the Clik Valve system. Now, before getting into the technical details, in my last video, I actually installed the Clik Valves onto my bike and gave a full basic installation guide. So if you haven't watched that yet, I'd probably recommend starting there first before watching this video. One important thing from that installation process: always fully deflate the tire before removing an old Presta valve core, unless you want sealant absolutely everywhere and the valve core shooting into space. But this video is going to be a bit different. This isn't really about installation, it's more of a technical breakdown and buyer's guide. I want to compare Clik valves directly against traditional Presta valves, explain why they were created in the first place, talk about the real world pros and cons of both systems, answering some common compatibility questions, and figure out whether this is actually worthwhile upgrade or just another cycling trend. Because that's really the big question here. Do Clik valves actually solve meaningful problems, or are cyclists just buying a fancier way to put air in the tire? To answer that properly, we first need to understand how Presta valves actually work. A Presta valve is essentially a narrow springless air valve that relies on tire pressure itself to keep the valve sealed shut. Before inflating the tire, you have to manually unscrew the tiny top nut to unlock the valves. Once unlocked, the internal valve stem can move freely and allow air in and out. Then, when you attach a pump, the pump physically forces air pressure into the valve faster than the tire can push back against it. Simple design, lightweight, narrow profile, high pressure, capable. That's why Presta valves became the standard for road cyclists in the first place. Back when narrow, high pressure rims dominated the cycling world, the small diameter of Presta valve allow manufacturers to drill smaller valve holes into skinnier rims without weakening them structurally. Meanwhile, Schrader valves, like the ones you see on a car tire, require larger holes and are heavier hardware. So historically, Presta valves made perfect sense. The problem is modern cycling has changed a lot. Today, we have wide gravel rims, carbon mountain bike wheels, tubeless systems, high volume tires, inserts, sealants, suspension pumps, mini pumps, CO2 systems, and riders constantly adjusting their tire pressure depending on the terrain. And suddenly, a lot of the weaknesses of a traditional Presta design start to become obvious. The biggest issue is airflow. A standard Presta valve has a very narrow internal chamber. That restriction limits how quickly air can move into the tire. For normal inflation, that's usually fine, but for tubeless setups, especially, airflow becomes extremely important. Tubeless tires often require a sudden high volume burst of air to seat the bead against the rim. That's why many riders end up needing air compressors or booster pumps. The Schwalbe Clik Valve was basically designed around solving that exact issue. Instead of using the traditional narrow Presta core valve, Clik uses much wider internal airflow path with a spring-loaded sealing mechanism. Schwalbe claims airflow increases somewhere around 50 to 70% depending on the setup. That airflow increase is probably the single most important engineering difference between the two systems because it changes more than just inflation speed. Higher airflow means faster tire inflation, easier tubeless seating, less airflow restriction, better capability with lower volume hand pumps, and more efficient pressure equalization. And weirdly enough, this is where the click system starts feeling less like a gimmick and more like an actual evolution to the valve itself. The connection method is another major difference. Traditional Presta systems rely on friction, threads, or locking levers depending on the pump head design. Some pumps clamp onto the valve, others screw directly onto the threaded valve stem itself. That's part of why Presta valves are so easy to damage. The entire sealing and attachment system depends on a thin external thread that's cut into a tiny brass shaft. If the pump gets pulled sideways, the valve system bends easily. Sometimes the cord loosens accidentally, sometimes the entire valve unscrews from the stem while removing the pump. Almost every cyclist has experienced one of these problems. Click approaches the problem completely different. Instead of threading or clamping onto the outside of the valve, Click uses a push on, spring retained interface. You push on the pump onto the valve until it mechanically locks in place. Then you pull it off when you're finished. No threads, no locking lever, no having to screw and unscrew. And because the connection system is spring loaded internally, the valve seals before the pump disconnects. That's why Click experiences almost zero measurable tire pressure loss when removing the pump. With Presta valves, the familiar psh sound after pumping usually includes at least some actual tire pressure escaping before the valve reseats itself. With click valves, most of the sound is simply residue hose pressure leaving the pump hose itself. Now, all that sounds extremely good so far, but there are definitely trade offs. This is where I think a lot of online discussions become too biased in favor of click without talking enough about the downsides. The first major downside is the ecosystem compatibility. Presta valves became the industry standard partially because almost every cycling pump on Earth already supports them. Click valves do not. To properly use the system, you either need a dedicated click compatibility pump head, a click conversion adapter, or a native click pump. Now, technically, yes, you can still inflate the click using certain push on or clamp on Presta pumps if absolutely necessary. So, if you forget your adapter mid ride, you're probably not stranded, but there are limitations. Generally, do not work properly. The pressure gauges may read incorrectly because the system doesn't create the proper back pressure inside the hose. Usually the gauge measures hose pressure instead of the actual tire pressure. So in emergency situations, you usually inflate based on feel rather than actual PSI. Another thing people ask is about CO2 compatibility. And yes, click valves, click valve adapters generally work perfectly fine with most CO2 inflators because the adapters usually use standard Schrader style threading interfaces. That's actually really important for road and gravel riders carrying flat repair kits. But there are still durability concerns. One criticism most riders have mentioned is leverage stress on the core valve itself. Because some adapters extend slightly outward from the rim, aggressive side loading from mini pumps or awkward pump angles can potentially snap the valve core. This is especially important with portable pumps where it force angles that aren't always perfectly straight. Another weakness is pressure adjustment. With a Presta valve, if you want to drop 1 or 2 psi trail side, you just tap the valve with your fingertip and you're down pressure. Click valves don't really allow you to do that because the release pin sits recessed inside the valve body. You're able to use a small object or a tool to depress it properly. Personally, I used my fingernail and it's worked just fine, but Presta valves are a bit simpler. Then there's probably the biggest unanswered long-term question: tubeless sealant contamination. Tubeless sealant works its way into literally everything over time, and because click valves usually are more mechanically complex, some riders have already reported sticking valves or leaking caused by sealant buildup inside the mechanism itself. Traditional Presta valves aren't immune to sealant issues either, but they are genuinely easier to disassemble and clean. So right now, long-term reliability is probably still one of the biggest unknowns surrounding the click system. And honestly, that's why I don't think this is a universal upgrade for every cyclist yet. If you barely pump up your tires, don't run tubeless, already own high-end Presta pumps, and never had issues with traditional valves, you probably don't need the click valves. But click might be for you if you're regularly dealing with tubeless setups. It's easier to bead tires onto the rim. You hate air loss while disconnecting pumps, or have air loss not fully tightening the Presta valve. If you're constantly fighting awkward pump head angles and bending your valve cores, if you maintain multiple bikes, it's easier to pump up between bikes. It takes less time. Your bikes sit over time, they lose pressure if they sit, and you're always having to pump it up before every ride. It helps newer riders inflate their tires, such as kids or people who don't understand how to use a bike pump. You're able to just click it on and click it off. Or if you just appreciate a cleaner mechanical design and don't want to waste those extra seconds every time you have to pump up a tire. If one of those sounds like you, the upgrade is honestly, it starts to make more sense. Because the biggest strength of the click system isn't necessarily one individual feature. It's that almost every little interaction with inflating tires feels slightly more refined. After using both systems back to back, the traditional Presta valve suddenly starts feeling surprisingly outdated for modern cycling. If you're wondering what I think about them personally, I have just ordered another set for my gravel bike, and they're now installed on that. They're installed on my mountain bike. The adapter is already attached to my pump at my house, and I don't have to do anything other than click it on and click it off. So personally, short term, they're great. I ride multiple bikes. Every time I hop on a bike, I'm probably going to need to pump up the air because it was sitting for a little bit. So it just saves the hassle of having to unscrew the cap, unscrew the valve, lock on the pump head, screw everything back. With the click, I can just click it on, click it off. And also because click is a slightly newer, less long-term tested object, it might have some problems in the future. But as of now, I haven't came across any of those. If you have came across any issues with your click system, let me know in the comments below. And let me know if you got a click system on your bike, if you're thinking about buying one, or if you have any other questions that I didn't mention in this video, just comment them and I'll get to them. I appreciate you guys watching. Hopefully this video helped. If you haven't watched that installation of the click valves on my other video, you should definitely go watch that. It was something pretty funny. I forgot to let the air out of my tire before I untwisted the core, and you'll go watch it in the video, but it shot into space. All right, thank you for watching.